I am going to look a little bit at the existing provisions on what we call sustainable public procurement and the existing points of legal uncertainty, because I think that's important to give some context to the sort of critique that I'm going to give of what's in the new proposals. I'll then go into a summary of what I see as the most relevant changes for sustainable public procurement in the draft directives, and focusing on these 4 areas, which are technical specifications, and specifically within that, the ability to address production processes and methods in your technical specification. This ability to refer to labels, whether they be eco-labels or social labels, also in your technical specifications. The whole area of award criteria, and within that life cycle costing, the new provisions on that within the proposals. And finally, this innovation partnership procedure. I'll touch on that to look at what's on offer there. Okay, so very quickly, the objectives of the reform, the sort of 2 key objectives identified for the Commission were on the efficiency end, to improve the efficiency, and then also to promote the strategic use of public procurement. And as Patrick mentioned, it's within the Europe 2020 sort of overarching policy. On the environmental side, you can put this in the context of sort of ongoing support from the European Commission for green public procurement, at least. They are dedicating resources to this. There's an existing action plan. It's mainly handled by DG Environment as part of the sustainable production and consumption policy. There's also been guidance produced on this. Some of you may be familiar with the Buying Green handbook, which is out there. Also guidance on social aspects of public procurement, which was published last year. And on top of that, you have an increasing awareness and of innovation and SME potential. This is something that's coming very much, I think, from the member states, support for SMEs and also for their own innovation policies, some of which we discussed yesterday. So all of that was sort of in the mix in the consultation process. As Patrick mentioned, there was a green paper published, quite a few responses from a mix of organisations. I think if you have a look at the responses, as far as I can tell, there is a preponderance towards business and association responses to the consultation, but also a number of public authorities at various levels and sort of third sector, NGOs, etc. Then the evaluation, along with the actual response or sort of consolidation of the Commission in response to that. In June of last year, they published a series of reports, which many of you may have seen, on different aspects of the public procurement regime as it's functioned since the implementation of the 2004 directives. And I'm going to look at a little bit of what was in that because I think it is very relevant in the context of SPP. And then finally, obviously, the proposals were published in December and they're currently being reviewed, as Patrick mentioned. Okay, so in that evaluation that came out in June of last year, I just want to pick out a few sort of salient points as I would see them. They were looking at the overall, trying to get a picture of the overall impact of the 2004 directives. And there are, I think, 6 separate reports commissioned on this, on different aspects of it. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And if you read the reports, you'll see all of the people who wrote them, and with all of whom I'm sure did their best, but it's very difficult to get an accurate view of the impact of the directives on public procurement. Part of the problem, of course, is that only a minority of public procurement procedures are actually advertised or go through any type of formal procedure. I think it's roughly 18%. Of contracts. I can't actually remember whether that's by number or by value. I think it's by number. But the findings do sort of give us a picture of what has, areas where, there are objectives still to be achieved and areas where maybe there has been some progress. So we have the finding that only 20% that in 20% of contract award notices, they only record one bid being received for OJU level tenders. Which to me sounds like quite a high number. If you're publishing something in the OJU, you would normally expect there to be more than one bid. However, the average is up at 5.4. So obviously, averages can disguise large variations, but you could say, okay, that's a relatively healthy response for most tenders. Of course, it depends on whether it's open or restricted procedure, etc. What I find is quite a sort of shocking finding in the context of this whole European project, which is meant to be about promoting cross-border competition for contracts, as well as other objectives such as transparency. But only 1.6% of contract award notices show any direct cross-border procurement, so where a contract was awarded to an economic operator in another member state. If you look at indirect cross-border procurement, i.e. awarding something to a subsidiary of an economic operator in another member state, that's higher, that's around 11%. But I would say that these are still quite low numbers in terms of the overall objectives of promoting cross-border competition. Cost impact, this gets into even woollier ground in terms of trying to measure it. There was an econometric analysis done which found that on average you'd get a 3.8 saving for the open procedure compared to not going through an ODU level procedure, and 2.5% for the restricted procedure. But these are based on comparison with the initial estimate made by the contracting authority as to how much the procurement would cost them. Okay, so that's a picture in terms of competition and cross-border issues. In terms of this overall heading of the strategic use of public procurement, under which the Commission is locating social, environmental and innovation policy objectives, there was a survey done, and I mentioned this yesterday as well, of 2,300 contracting authorities, which found that 64% of them were including environmental criteria in their tenders regularly, sometimes, or as much as possible. So again, that's a fairly woolly definition, but as I mentioned yesterday, it shows that a majority of contracting authorities are at least aware of environmental issues in their tendering. It's not a fringe interest. It's not something that's outside of what's happening in procurement across the EU. 49% included social criteria with the same frequency, and 48% actually said that they included criteria aimed at the procurement of innovation, which I find quite surprising. I occasionally, when I'm really bored, go through the notices on TED, and I don't see very much mention of innovation, but obviously it could be in the tender documents. Okay, so turning specifically to the sort of social and environmental issues, just offering a definition there for sustainable public procurement, which is it really emphasizes this entire life cycle idea. You're not just looking at, the use phase. You're really looking at where are the products and services that we're purchasing coming from, what is the impact that they're going to have throughout their life cycle. And this ties in very much to the idea of sustainable development, which again is a mainstream concept in the EU. All member states have made a commitment to it, at least at some level, and the EU itself is obviously trying to mainstream this within its policy. And the majority of member states now have actually adopted a policy on GPP or SPP. I think it's 25 out of the 27. Again, some of those have mandatory requirements that every public authority must include certain minimum environmental or social criteria. Some of them are merely setting targets or aspirations. At EU level, GPP is a voluntary measure. I think it's important to point this out. Within the 2004 directives, you can include environmental or social criteria, but there's very few cases in which you'd actually be required to do that. And that was one of the questions that came up in the consultation. Should we be moving to mandatory measures in procurement, that all EU public authorities have to take some account of environmental and social issues in the procurement? In large part, the proposals that have been issued reject that. There's very little in the way of mandatory provisions related to environmental or social considerations. Some examples would be of where it is mandatory is that requirement to reject abnormally low tenders, where you find that there's a violation of certain environmental or social laws. But that's really the exception rather than the general trend in these proposals. Okay, just to look briefly at some of the case law that's developed in this area, because this is one area in which I think that the European Court of Justice has sometimes been ahead of the curve, or ahead of the Commission anyways, in terms of its view on these matters. The sort of seminal case I would see is the Beaches case, which gets cited a lot about inclusion of long-term unemployed, and also the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, which picked up on some of the findings in that case and introduced this idea of an additional award criterion based on long-term unemployed. The case that Patrick mentioned earlier of Concordia, which was based on Helsinki City Council awarding their bus contract. And that really is the most cited case in this whole area of sustainable public procurement, because it set out sort of very clearly that, yes, if you're using most economically advantageous tender as your award criterion, you can include environmental considerations. Not every award criterion has to confer an economic benefit on the contracting authority. That position was subsequently written into the 2004 directives very clearly, but with the caveats which Patrick also mentioned of a link to the subject matter of the contract, general proportionality requirements, transparency requirements in terms of identifying your criteria in your tender documents or contract notice. Building on the Concordia case was a case from 2001, the EVN and Wintrom case, which sort of there's an open question coming out of Concordia as I see it in terms of, well, what is a link to the subject matter of the contract, and can we have an example, please, of an award criterion which would not be linked to the subject matter of the contract? We got that in the EVN case, in which it was found that an award criterion based on capacity to provide renewable electricity above and beyond what the contracting authority was trying to purchase in that case was not considered to be linked to the subject matter of the contract. So you can look at, you could have an award criterion based on renewable electricity. You could also have a technical specification saying we want electricity from renewable sources. What you cannot have is an award criterion that says, what is your general capacity as an organisation to provide renewable electricity? And this was an approach that was being used, and I have to say still is being used, I believe, by a lot of German and Austrian authorities to try and build up renewable electricity capacity. It's an example of horizontal objectives coming into procurement and sort of using procurement to try to leverage the market in a particular direction. But the court made it quite clear that in this case, that in its view, that was outside of the legitimate scope for procurement. We currently have a case being litigated, which is quite interesting in this area as well. It's about a Dutch authority which had specified that it wanted to buy coffee that came from both ecologically sound sources and which came from sources that could verify that they abided by certain fair trade principles in terms of the source of the coffee, the rates of pay that are given to the workers involved. It's possibly not the best test case for this type of issue because the manner in which the Dutch authority referred to these labels, in my view, was a fairly blatant violation of what you can do under the current directives. That's just my personal view. We have quite an interesting opinion from the Advocate General in this case, but we don't yet know whether the court is going to follow that. The Advocate General, by the way, was very encouraging in terms of the use of environmental and social criteria, but ultimately treated the social criteria in that case as being a contract performance clause rather than a technical specification. And as we'll see later, you have a little bit more scope in terms of contract performance clauses for social and environmental purposes. So that's some of the case law. In addition to the sort of procurement rules themselves and the cases that come out of that, we have other mandatory EU legislation which has a direct impact on procurement. And this is a sort of interesting field because if you're a contracting authority, you might think, okay, I've got the treaty, I've got the directives, I'm aware of the case law, I'm good to go on procurement. But there actually is legislation that will affect what you're doing outside of that. We've got the Energy Star regulation, which requires that when central government authorities are buying office IT equipment, they must include minimum energy efficiency criteria which at least match the Energy Star standards. That was introduced in 2008. We have the Clean Vehicles Directive, which is very interesting because it looks at taking into account both emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy consumption when you're buying vehicles, and requires contracting authorities to take those into account, either in their technical specifications or in their award criteria, or both. So that's an interesting development. And this is actually of relevance for what I'm going to be looking at in my next few slides, because it does allow you to assign a specific cost to CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions. And it gives you actually in the back of that directive a table of the values that you have to assign to these emissions. So that's a very clear indication that you can take environmental criteria into account and that you can assign a cost to them. And interestingly, that cost is not a cost which is being directly incurred by the contracting authority. It's a general environmental societal cost, but we're being told in this directive that you can monetize those. Okay, I won't go into detail on the other two. Those are just two other examples of directives which have an impact, and 2B, obviously, most people will be aware of on the social side, needs to be taken into account in many procurement processes. Okay, so in terms of the 2004 directives, just to touch briefly on what I would see as the main provisions relevant here. Patrick already mentioned the reservation to sheltered workshops, currently in Article 19. You've got Article 23 and the Annex 6 of the 2004 directives, which talk about technical specifications. I think it's important to include the Annex because that's where we're told at present that you can look at production processes and methods and technical specifications, which is very important in this whole area. You've got Article 26 and 27 on contract conditions, saying specifically, Article 26 mentions social and environmental provisions as contract clauses, and it's one of the few places in the 2004 directives where social is actually mentioned along with environmental, basically suggesting that contract conditions are a good place to put in your social and environmental requirements. I'll look at that a bit later in terms of the problems that may create in terms of existing law such as precedent and material change. Your Article 45 exclusion grounds, not specifically mentioning environmental or social issues, but if you have a violation of a national law in these areas, that could be a grounds for exclusion under Article 45. Under Articles 48 and 50, we're told that you can look at the environmental management measures that an operator would be able to put into place and use that as a selection criterion. It's only for works and services contracts at present. It doesn't apply to supply contracts, but that looks like it's going to change in the new draft. Article 53, of course, award criteria. As I mentioned, you've got your Concordia requirements now incorporated in that article. And finally, Article 55 on abnormally low tenders, which is interesting because it doesn't, at present, the way it's written, it's all about what you need to take into account if you want to exclude production processes and methods. So again, going back to this example of renewable electricity, does that need to alter the final product? And there has been suggestion in Commission guidance, and they've tried to argue in a few cases that this needs to be, and this is a way of sort of keeping technical specifications related to what you're actually procuring, that it has to somehow alter the product. In my view, and it's been explained by much better legal scholars than I, this is a nonsense, basically, because if you can have renewable electricity, the final product is not in any discernible way different from electricity that comes from non-renewable sources. It is physically, materially, exactly the same. So the only reason you would be able to have renewable electricity is if you're looking at the production processes and methods, and if that's a legitimate way of specifying your requirements. Similarly, you've got uncertainty regarding references to labels. As I mentioned, you've got this current case that's being litigated. Okay, you can refer to labels, but you also have to accept equivalent labels. Do you also have to accept a self-declaration from the manufacturer, as opposed to a third-party label or certification? That's an area where there's been a lot of confusion, and also specifically the area of social labels. Can you include social criteria in these labels? Award criteria, again, the link to the subject matter of the contract test, not always clear what that excludes, what it doesn't exclude. This is very important for things like looking at CO2 emissions. So, if I want to have an award criterion and I want to, let's say I'm buying printer cartridges and I want to award more marks to someone who has lower CO2 emissions associated with the delivery of that contract. So I ask everyone to, as part of their bid, saying, okay, and what are your CO2 emissions associated with the delivery? Somebody might come back to me and say, look, I have very, very low CO2 emissions because I'm going to relocate my warehouse next to your premises, right? So the CO2 emissions for this contract are very, very low. But by the way, in doing that, I'm increasing my global emissions by a factor of 2. Because my logistics to deliver to all my other customers are now worse. So when you start looking at environmental and social procurement, the link to the subject matter tests is sometimes going to be problematic if you take a narrow view of what you can take into account. Finally, looking at contract performance clauses, as I mentioned, this is under the current directive suggested to be the sort of ideal place to address your social and environmental considerations. Don't put them in your competition, put them in your contract performance clauses. Again, in my view, this is problematic, especially given the case law on material amendments. Because if I don't properly examine something in my tender procedure by having it in my technical specifications and or in my award criteria, how do I know that my contractor can actually deliver those? You know, it's great to insert a clause in your contract saying, by the way, you have to make sure that none of your sub-suppliers use any child labour under any circumstances. But if my contractor doesn't actually have the capacity to do that or to inspect their subcontractors, then what's the point? You know, and I can't then go and change my contract later on, as we know from this line of cases. Okay. So just turning to what is actually in the proposals. Am I doing okay on time? Fine. Yeah. Okay. So we've got an increased scope for contracts to be reserved to these sort of protected workshops under Article 17. You've also got an explicit recognition about this production processes or methods question which has arisen. As I would argue that this isn't something new because it's already in the directives, but it's just sort of emphasising it a bit more. And it also starts referring to the entire life cycle of products and services, which is, in my view, a good development. You've also, it's got the specific possibility to refer to environmental or social labels. I'm going to look in a bit more detail at that Article 41 because I think the way it's drafted at the moment could cause a lot of confusion. Patrick mentioned this as well, that you can invoke non-compliance either as grounds to refuse to award a contract to a tender, so that suggests that it's after you've already gone through your evaluation, or at the beginning stage of exclusion. However, this only includes EU or international social and environmental law, so it doesn't extend to national laws in these areas. You've also, as I mentioned, you've now extended this ability to look at environmental management measures. So at the moment, it's only for works and services contracts. You're now going to be able to do it for supplies as well. It's an interesting change, this one, because it's not highlighted anywhere in the sort of introduction or recitals to the directives, whereas most of the other changes are. So I don't know if it's intentional that they've widened this ability. But in any case, I think it would be quite useful in the case of supply contracts to be able to look at environmental management measures, because many of these supply contracts do have intense environmental burden associated with them. Okay, and then the life cycle costing provision, this is Article 67. Again, I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail. But just to note that it does allow you specifically to include external environmental costs. And then, again, sort of ongoing recognition of the role of contract conditions. And then Patrick mentioned the sort of reporting or oversight responsibilities, and these now also include the responsibility to report on sustainable public procurement. So that's on there. Okay, what the only provisions that I see as being really new in this or potentially useful for sustainable public procurement is this increased ability to reserve to sheltered workshops, although unfortunately they're not in use in a lot of member states. But in those where they are, they can be a very useful way of integrating people with disabilities into the workforce or people who are long-term unemployed, etc. It now actually includes disadvantaged workers as well as people who have disabilities.
The government here is closing them down.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think they have quite a few in France, though, don't they? I'm not sure. Yeah. And a few maybe in other member states, but that was one that I think got into the 2004 directives. I think it was France was just lobbying to get it in there, and it got in at the last minute. And now it's good to see that it's being extended, but I don't think it's actually used in that many cases. Okay, and then you've got the explicit reference to production processes and methods, life cycle costing and labels. As I said, those are all allowed under the current directives. And there is the threat that by introducing specific rules on these, the new proposals will actually make it more difficult to use them because they're introducing restrictions on what you can do in some of these areas. So there's an intention, I think, to resolve some of the legal uncertainty, but it may actually make it worse in some cases. Okay, on labels specifically, I think, sorry for putting long quotes, but I figured there are enough lawyers here that I wouldn't be thrown out immediately. But and I think the devil really is in the detail of these provisions, so it's maybe worth looking at them in some detail. On labels, they say, if you're looking at environmental, social, or other characteristics, it says you may require that they bear a specific label. Now, I don't think that could possibly be true, or the intention to change it to that, because I don't think it would be allowed under the WTO GPA rules, for one thing. And if you look then, it actually takes away that ability. It sets out sort of what those labels can regulate. And then the next paragraph says, if you're requiring a specific label, you must also accept all equivalent labels, and you must also accept a technical dossier of the manufacturer, which is essentially a self-declaration. But if I was your average contracting authority, or indeed your average person in any situation reading this, I would assume that that first paragraph meant I can require a specific label, because that's what it says. But you can't. You have to accept equivalent labels or self-declarations. Just my own view on that is that we're never, equivalent labels are great. It's always great to have to look at equivalence. And again, under WTO, we should be doing that. But a self-declaration is qualitatively different from a third-party certification for environmental and social matters. It's not the same thing. So I would be very happy to see that last sentence removed. On life cycle costing, again, I quoted it in full because it's just to sort of see that the overall structure of it. Again, life cycle costing is possible under the current directives as an award criterion. It's required for certain sectors, i.e. vehicles, that you have to look at the full life cycle costs and include emissions. This is now just sort of setting out a procedure for it. But at the same time, as I said, it's limiting what you can do with life cycle costing, because they're saying, OK, you have to choose a methodology, you have to put in your tender documents. But then the second requirement that I've put in bold, it has to be established for repeated or continuous application. That means you can't sort of sit down at the beginning of a contract award process and say, OK, we're buying street lighting, and we want to look at the whole life cycle costs for that. What are our particular requirements? What are we going to take into account? Maybe there's a life cycle costing methodology out there that we can use, but maybe there's not. Maybe we want to come up with our own specific methodology for this contract that reflects our needs and the impact of this contract. That second condition, I think, would make it quite difficult, or at least quite challengeable, if you did do that. You also have to allow tenderers to submit their own methodology. And for anyone who's ever tried to actually do a life cycle costing exercise, this is going to make it much more complex, and I would think much more legally vulnerable. If I want to give people an Excel sheet and say, here, fill this out and tell me about your environmental impact at each stage of the process, and here I've identified the stages of the process for you so that I can compare all bids when I get them back, you're not going to be allowed to insist on them doing that. You have to allow them to submit their own. Yeah. 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I think it's getting to the end. Okay. Again, this is a recital on social criteria. Just to note that they are trying to restrict, in terms of award criteria, what you can do. So this is saying, all right, you can do it in your technical specifications and award criteria. And then you can look at conditions, working conditions. It must be for the persons directly participating in the process. Okay, that seems sort of fair enough with our link to the subject matter. But then it goes on to say they can only concern the protection of health of the staff or the favouring of social integration of disadvantaged peoples or persons or members of vulnerable groups. So that would exclude things like looking at child labour. That would exclude things like looking at the payment of a living wage. Now it's a recital, it's not a provision of the directive itself, but I think it would definitely, the court would have to have regard to that in its interpretation of what you can do with award criteria. Now, you could say, OK, if you want to address child labour, you do it in other ways. You do it in your exclusion conditions or in your contract clauses. But award criteria specifically play a special role in procurement, as I think we all know. This is where you're actually able to compare bids with each other and reach a decision about who does something best. So they're limiting what can be done in terms of looking at that supply chain conditions. And then also a sort of general savour that it has to be limited to those that have immediate consequences on staff members. So they are trying to restrict it there. Just turning very briefly to procurement of innovation, because it's a topic that's relevant, that we spoke about yesterday as well. At the moment, what we have is an exemption for the procurement of R&D services, and this is under Article 16 of the 2004 directives. And you have two sort of conditions for that. The services must be fully paid for by the authority, and there has to be some more general benefit. And people have argued a bit about, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you can't keep the IP rights in these R&D services? But that's sort of the structure of the exemption as it is now. We also have guidance from 2007 on a particular procedure to take advantage of this exemption, which is called pre-commercial procurement. There hasn't been a whole lot of take-up of this outside. I think there's been several in Belgium and the Netherlands, but outside of those countries there hasn't been mass uptake of PCP. It's a relatively complex procedure. You also can't buy the outcome of those R&D services without having a separate competition, which is covered by the procurement rules normally. So it's a little bit restrictive. The Commission has tried to address this by introducing an article, and I think there must be a rule that new innovative elements of directives are always in Article 29, because we had the competitive dialogue, I think, in Article 29 the last time. But anyways, it's an innovation partnership. Just very briefly, I think this article is creating sort of unnecessary restrictions on what you can do. It says that you can use the competitive procedure with negotiation, which is the new procedure that Patrick mentioned, to set up these partnerships. And this could potentially cover both the R&D services and the actual purchase of the products or services that come out of that. However, it's in my view, balanced quite heavily towards the supplier, because it's saying you have to pay them in installments, which may not be appropriate in every case. If you're getting a grant for R&D services from some other source, why should the contracting authority have to pay you for your development work? It also, and this is a very strange provision, I think, to have in the EU directives, to say that the value and duration of the contract, they must be within appropriate limits, taking into account the need to recover the costs, including those incurred in the development, and to achieve an adequate profit. Now, I think this really takes the EU procurement directives beyond the how, the procedures, into the what. You know, and my own view is that it's not for the European Union to legislate how much profit should be involved in public contracts. But that's just my own view.
Great.
Yeah. So, summary.
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, we've got widespread existing use, as we saw there in the figures, mandatory legislation in this area as well, areas of legal uncertainty, some effort in the new proposals to address these, but I think possibly one step forward, two steps back in some cases, and specific problems, I would say, with the innovation partnership. So that's me there.
Abby, thank you very much.
No problem. Yeah.